Ethereum is set to receive its second major update of the year, and it's called Fusaka. I think this is a much more interesting update than Pectra, which hit mainnet in May, and that's because Fusaka has both a dramatic headline feature in the form of PeerDAS, but also because it's Ethereum's most carefully considered and strategically aligned update ever. In this way, Fusaka is much more than just an update. It's a representation of a change that has taken place in Ethereum's culture and community in recent months. This change has been clear online in the past, but it has yet to make a truly tangible impact on anything. But Fusaka is proof that Ethereum really is on a war footing and is finally responding to competitive pressures from chains like Solana. So let's dig in and see what Fusaka is all about. As I've covered before, Ethereum upgrades are really a pair of upgrades, one on the consensus layer and one on the execution layer. In this case, they are called Fulu and Osaka respectively. Fusaka comes from combining those names together. It's scheduled to arrive at slot 13,164,544, which is going to take place on December 3rd. Fusaka contains 12 EIPs, or changes, that are designed to increase Ethereum's throughput, make it an even better foundation for Layer 2 chains, and improve the user experience. I think it's worth noting the context that Fusaka arrives in, because this is the first update to have been truly shaped by changes made at the Ethereum Foundation, or EF, earlier this year. The EF is the non-profit organisation established in 2014 to steward Ethereum and support its development. But it had faced significant and growing criticism for things like poor communication, slow execution of ideas, and a general inability to recognise or respond to the competitive pressures that Ethereum has come under in recent years. As a result, the EF underwent a big shake-up in March of this year, appointing a pair of co-executive directors to oversee things. After just a month in their new roles, these directors published a blog post detailing their new strategic objectives. These were scaling the Ethereum mainnet, scaling blobs, and improving UX, all without compromising Ethereum's existing security or hardness. Looking at Fusaka, it's notable how every change clearly aligns with these objectives. It's easy to categorise all of the EIPs according to which strategy they support, though some do span more than one category. Additionally, some of these changes also relate to an implicit, community-driven objective of driving more value accrual to Ether, something that has been overlooked in the past but would clearly make ETH a more attractive asset. Now, none of this may sound revolutionary. Frankly, this is how updates should have been done since day one. But historically, most of Ethereum's upgrades have felt like a grab bag of different ideas, and therefore they failed to give the impression of a network making meaningful progress towards desired goals. The last update, Pectra, was a good example of this unfocused approach. My assessment at the time of that update was that while everything it delivered was good, it lacked a clear focus and therefore felt listless and uninspired. It certainly didn't deliver anything like the change that the Ethereum community was demanding at that particularly dark and challenging time. And that's what makes Fusaka so exciting. It's not just what it's doing, it's how it's doing it. Fusaka is the first update in a long time that makes you feel like Ethereum is capable of delivering meaningful change, that it can solve key issues that have blighted the platform for so long, and that it can truly compete with the supposed Ethereum killers. So let's unpack all of these changes and see how they relate to Ethereum's new strategic goals. We'll start with blob scaling, because that is the focus of Fusaka's headline feature. As a quick reminder, blobs were introduced in early 2024 and provide a temporary storage space for L2 data on Ethereum. They are Ethereum's data availability, or DA, solution. You can think of them as literal blobs that stick on the outside of Ethereum blocks, so they can be passed around all of the nodes on the network. But after a short amount of time, they can be picked off and discarded by anyone who doesn't want to permanently store that data. Each blob is paired with a transaction that remains inside the block, even after the blob has been removed. This transaction contains a commitment to the blob. This is essentially a special reference that can be used to prove that some data is indeed in a blob. There are two key things to remember here as we dive into Fusaka's changes. First, every node in the network currently has to download and verify every blob in its entirety. And second, as I just mentioned, every blob has a corresponding transaction that is contained inside the block. EIP 7594, better known as PeerDAS, focuses on the first of those things to remember. It will allow nodes to verify blob data using just a fraction of the blob, so they will no longer need to download the entire thing. In fact, most nodes will download just 1/8 of the blob's data. What's more, So long as nodes across the network all hold truly random fractions of the blob, the entire blob could be reconstructed with just half the data. This is made possible using some clever maths called Reed-Solomon erasure coding, which is the same thing used to make DVDs scratch resistant. In Ethereum, it will allow additional blobs to be added to blocks. Because most nodes will only download 1/8 of the data, you could theoretically add 8 times as many blobs to blocks without increasing the node's workload or bandwidth requirements. In short, Ethereum could vastly increase its DA capacity without increasing demand on the network. Here's how it works. Under PeerDAS, blob data will be converted into a series of numbers that are taken to be coefficients of a smooth polynomial curve. You'll probably remember polynomials from school as expressions that look a bit like this. The polynomial created here will obviously be much longer and more complex, but is essentially the same thing. And here, it's also a compressed mathematical description of the original data. Now, here's where this gets really clever. If we imagine plotting that polynomial on a graph, we'd see that the line would continue on well beyond the original data. In fact, we could keep plugging new numbers into the expression and generating new points on the same curve. And the crucial thing here is that these points are still on the same curve. They are still defined by the same expression. Therefore, while they are fictitious data points that aren't included in the original blob data, they are very closely related to it. Ethereum will generate enough new points on the curve that it will effectively double the original data, creating a lot of redundant points that can be used to reconstruct the original blob if necessary. Next, it will batch all of these data points into 128 groups, called columns, so that each column contains a series of consecutive data points from the polynomial curve. Then, each column is distributed across its own specialized subnet. Every node in the network is randomly assigned at least 4 subnets based on its unique ID, which should ensure a uniform and random distribution of all blob data. And it's worth noting that some nodes will be required to subscribe to additional subnets. Once a validator is tied to a node, meaning the person running that node is staking ETH and participating in block production, they will need to subscribe to 8 subnets. If they stake more than 287 ETH, they will need to subscribe to more than 8, with a total number of subnets depending on the quantity of ETH staked. And finally, anyone staking 4,096 ETH or more, the equivalent to 2 maxed out validators, will be considered supernodes and have to connect to every subnet. Therefore, they would receive every column and download every blob in its entirety. They are also expected to redistribute this information to the rest of the network to help heal any gaps that may appear. Of course, based on the amount of ETH they hold, these supernodes should be able to afford the overheads associated with all of this. But to reiterate, the key number here is 8. The majority of nodes will only subscribe to 8 of the 128 subnets, and therefore receive only 8 of the 128 columns. That's equivalent to 1/16 of all of the data, including the extended data. But because the data was doubled for redundancy earlier in the process, this 1/16 is really just 1/8 of the original data. And that's where the big savings come in. That is why PeerDAS could enable up to 8 times as many blobs. It's also worth noting that every data point in every column comes with everything necessary to verify that data against the commitment in the block. Therefore, every node, no matter how many columns it receives, can be completely confident that it has the correct data. Plus, as mentioned earlier, as long as anyone is able to collect at least half of these columns from across the network, they can reconstruct the entire blob. The way the data is distributed should ensure at least half the data is always available, even in difficult and adversarial conditions. So that is PeerDAS, an update that enables something that Vitalik has described as pretty unprecedented, a live blockchain that does not require any single node to download the full data. PeerDAS will allow Ethereum to increase the number of blobs that it can offer to L2s for their data storage needs, making it a better foundation for the modular world, and ultimately increasing throughput across the stack. Although PeerDAS unlocks additional blob capacity, Fusaka won't immediately take advantage of this. Instead, EIP 7892 introduces a new process for adjusting blob parameters, called Blob Parameter Only Forks, or BPO forks. These will allow Ethereum to incrementally increase the number of blobs on offer. Traditionally, hard forks, or network upgrades, have involved complex changes and required significant coordination from across the Ethereum ecosystem. Fusaka itself is an example of this kind of fork. BPO forks are much, much simpler. They will only change 3 blob-related parameters: the target number of blobs, the maximum number of blobs, and the base fee adjustment factor that influences the cost of accessing blobs. The idea is that the community can coordinate one of these BPO forks, increasing the target blob count to a higher number, and then wait and observe how the network handles these changes. If everything continues to run smoothly, then it will be safe to arrange another BPO fork and repeat the process. Perhaps you can think of BPO forks as a kind of dimmer switch that can be slowly dialed up, as opposed to the traditional on-off switch of a normal fork. The first 2 BPO forks are already scheduled. The first of these will go live on December 9th, 1 week after Fusaka. It will raise the target blob count from 6 to 10 blobs, and the maximum blob count from 9 to 15. The second is scheduled for a month after Fusaka on January 7th, and it will raise the target to 14 and the maximum to 21 blobs per block. The expectation is that these BPO forks will continue for some time, slowly increasing Ethereum's blob capacity without endangering the network with any sudden spikes. Ultimately, it's expected to end up at something like 72 blobs, but that of course depends on how Ethereum can hold up under that additional load. EIP 7918 is the final big change that Fusaka will make to blobs, and it's all about pricing them more effectively. 7918 will introduce a floor price for blobs so they don't get underpriced during periods of low demand. This should keep blob fees closer to the market clearing price, which will, in turn, smooth fluctuations in demand and ensure blob space is allocated more efficiently. Now, remember how every blob has to be submitted alongside a transaction that gets included in a block. In the current system, that can cause some blob pricing problems. The cost of including a transaction in a block is often very large relative to the cost of the blob itself, especially at times of low blob demand. Therefore, if blobs are running empty and Ethereum reduces blob fees, it doesn't stimulate demand in the way it should. For instance, if a transaction costs $10, it doesn't matter if Ethereum charges 1 cent or 1/10 of 1 cent to access a blob. The total cost of the transaction remains largely the same, and so no one steps in to make use of the cheap blobs. As a result, blobs can run empty for long stretches of time. Then, when demand returns, it can take more than an hour of over-target blob production to increase the price back to where it should be, the market clearing price, when supply and demand are in balance and only the target number of blobs are being produced. 7918 ties the minimum blob fee to the transaction fee, ensuring blob fees are always a meaningful portion of the total cost paid by blob consumers. That should protect the price signal and prevent fees from falling close to zero for lengthy periods. It will also ensure blob fees better reflect the computational cost that blobs impose on the Ethereum network, and it will create a stronger alignment between L2 usage and blob fee revenue, which will help Ethereum capture more value from the stack that it supports. Finally, this can be viewed as Ethereum throwing its weight around in the DA marketplace. Until now, it's effectively given blobs away with near zero fees, something that all of its competitors are also doing. But now it wants to sell these blobs to generate meaningful revenue. Ultimately, it's betting that its superior network effects, security, and liquidity give it pricing power relative to competitors like Celestia. Analysis by Fidelity Digital Assets suggests that this change could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars for Ethereum, and that, had it been introduced when blobs first launched, it could already have raised almost $80 million in additional revenue. Of course, this is all revenue that would otherwise be going to the L2s, who may well change their behaviour or even leave Ethereum entirely in an attempt to recapture it. So it's going to be fascinating to see how the industry reacts to this change. While the blob-related changes may grab the headlines in Fusaka, the bulk of the EIPs actually relate to scaling the L1. EIP 7935 is the most obvious change to highlight in this section, as it is literally about increasing Ethereum's capacity at the base layer. It raises the block gas limit, the size of a block in terms of how much computational effort it contains, from 45 million to 60 million gas, a 33% increase. Now, this isn't considered a core EIP, because Ethereum's validators are able to coordinate an increase in gas limit by simply signaling their readiness for it. However, because large block size increases should be thoroughly tested before going live, the EIP was included in Fusaka to ensure developers were preparing their clients for the additional workload. As validators across the network have updated their software in preparation for Fusaka, the number of them signaling readiness for 60 million gas increased until the network reached quorum at the end of November. Therefore, this change is actually already in effect, before Fusaka has gone live. Still, I wanted to mention it here as it's a large break from Ethereum's past. Until February of this year, Ethereum hadn't increased its gas limit since the merge in September 2022, despite continued improvements in consumer hardware and widespread criticism of Ethereum's limited throughput. 7935 is a sign that Ethereum is finally responding to that criticism, and it showcases the EF's and the community's renewed focus on L1 scaling. It means Ethereum has doubled its capacity in just 1 year, and it doesn't plan on stopping there. In fact, Ethereum wants to keep growing the base layer for the foreseeable future. Various changes and optimizations could allow it to triple its capacity every year for the next 3 years. Fusaka includes 5 EIPs that will make this sort of scaling both safe and achievable. This collection of changes includes EIP 7934, which adds a maximum block size measured in bytes alongside the limit measured in gas. Specifically, it limits blocks to a maximum of 10 megabytes. While still large, it will stop blocks from becoming unreasonably heavy and propagating slowly across the network, something that could result in temporary forks and disruption. It will also reduce the risk of denial of service attacks against Ethereum. Another example would be EIP 7939, which introduces a new opcode to count the number of leading zeros at the start of a 256-bit number. This may not sound like a particularly exciting change, but it will dramatically reduce the cost of certain operations and make some on-chain calculations much more efficient. 7939 is exactly the sort of update that can unlock additional performance from Ethereum's Layer 1, especially when it's combined with other similar changes. Finally, I wanted to mention EIP 7825, which caps the gas cost of a single transaction and stops them from hogging all of the block space. This change is very clearly focused on protecting Ethereum as it increases its block gas limit, but it also keeps an eye on the future. Because it limits how large a transaction can be, it effectively guarantees that blocks will contain multiple transactions. And this is important because future Ethereum upgrades will introduce parallel processing of transactions, which would obviously not be possible if a single transaction could occupy all available block space. Taken together, these EIPs, along with others that I've not mentioned, will allow Ethereum to scale smoothly and safely in the years ahead. Fusaka will also deliver significant UX improvements alongside the scaling-related changes. And for me, there are 2 EIPs that stand out here. EIP 7917 makes it clear which validator will be proposing blocks at a much earlier stage than we see today. Not only this, but the list of validators who will be proposing blocks will be completely deterministic and available on-chain. While this may not sound overly useful, it's actually incredibly important for the development of base rollups and pre-confirmations. Without going into all the details about what these terms mean right now, I'll just say that they could enable Layer 2 chains that feel truly rapid and more akin to Web 2 products, all without sacrificing Ethereum's decentralization or security guarantees. Based rollups should also drive more value to the L1 and therefore to Ether as an asset. It's still early days for both based rollups and pre-confirmations, so the UX improvements won't be immediate here, but this change definitely lays the foundations for them. And as a nice bonus, it also closes off some niche attack vectors and further strengthens Ethereum's design. EIP 7951 is more likely to have a UX impact in the short term. Essentially, it gives Ethereum native support for a cryptographic curve known as P256 that is widely used in everyday devices like your phone. In fact, P256 is used in everything from Apple's Secure Enclave to Android's key store to WebAuth passkeys. As a result, once Ethereum supports this curve, wallets will be able to do away with seed phrases and rely entirely on device-level biometrics and passkeys. That means that Ethereum applications will look and feel much more like the traditional Web 2 applications that most users are used to. This is the sort of change that's easy to overlook because it has such a technical and abstract name, but it could completely transform the way that people interact with Ethereum and significantly lower the barrier to entry. Hopefully, this has given you not only a better understanding of what Fusaka means for Ethereum, but it's shown you how these changes relate to Ethereum's strategic objectives. This isn't Petra's loose collection of incremental improvements. This is a bold and laser-focused update that promises to increase Ethereum's throughput, to scale blobs to support greater L2 activity, and to improve the user experience. And it will do all of these things without harming decentralization, without harming security, and while keeping value accrual in mind. Sure, Fusaka doesn't solve every problem, but it's definitely a step in the right direction, and it represents a much larger change than it delivers. It may be too early to say that Ethereum is back, but this update suggests that its darkest days, where it wandered aimlessly in the wilderness, are firmly behind it.